Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Ghost Recon Future Soldier for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is something vaguely resembling a tactical third-person shooter that was developed by Ubisoft, mainly Ubisoft Paris, and released in May of 2012 for PS3 and Xbox 360, and later on that year for PC. And it received some pretty decent reviews, although the reviews were a bit mixed depending on who you talked to. And you saw really low scores on PC compared to console for a variety of reasons, namely the fact that the PC port of this game is downright awful. And you'll be able to see that as I'm showing you footage of this thing. The frame rate just randomly drops, and I'm not entirely sure what causes it. In fact, nobody's entirely sure what causes it. But to give you an idea, on an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 970, it regularly drops below 60 frames a second. It should not be doing that. Not to mention that I've had numerous issues where the game would just glitch out on me, so they obviously haven't sorted out all of the bugs in this thing. And if you're going to decide to play this thing, you probably would want to play it on PS3 or Xbox 360, because at least those versions actually work properly. That said, the ultimate question really is, how is this thing as a tactical shooter, and more importantly, how is it in the grand scheme of Ghost Recon games? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into it. Well, as far as presentation goes, you can tell right off the bat that it's going for the brown and gray and realistic style of visuals, which is never really appealing in the slightest. But on top of that, it still really doesn't look all that good to begin with, which is kind of weird because this thing came out in a good time for graphics, and yet it just looks like a fairly standard Xbox 360 era game, at best. And it seems like they took some cues from Battlefield Bad Company in that they really like kicking up dust or throwing sandstorms in your face or snowstorms or any number of things like that, because half the time you can't even see what's going on because of the sheer amount of dust in the air. So you're going to be switching over to your magnetic vision most of the time, and that's what the game might as well look like, which is to say it looks mostly like a wireframe kind of thing. So if you were wondering why there's so much of that in this video, that's why, because the game really likes just making it really hard to see what you're doing. At any rate, they do have some kind of cool effects going on where it's sort of an augmented reality thing with the way they've set up the characters, where you have this sort of tactical view of things, and it will pop up with the names of things that you're looking at or descriptions of them and all sorts of things like that, which is kind of cool and a bit different, but it doesn't really do much to add to the experience. It's just kind of a neat little thing that they threw on there as sort of just a fine touch of things. But unfortunately, the visuals themselves are just not impressive, and even if you crank this thing all the way up to the max settings, which is what you're seeing here, you're going to find that it really doesn't look all that great, and so the visuals just kind of fall flat on it. Not to mention that the cutscenes are all pre-rendered and rather low quality, so they're blurry as hell, and that really does not appeal to the eye at all. And then there's the sound design, which is about what you would expect from Ubisoft at this point. They got some pretty solid voice acting for the most part, although the characters themselves are pretty much just cardboard cutouts of characters rather than actual characters, and so you don't really get a lot of really strong character acting in this thing. Instead, you just get a bunch of soldiers doing stuff and saying soldiery things with a lot of abbreviations to make the people who don't really know much of anything about warfare feel completely alienated, and those that we'd refer to as armchair generals just squee with glee and things like that. But it all just kind of falls flat in this thing just because of how the game actually turns out, which I'll get to in a moment. And the music is pretty standard stuff at this point for what you would expect from this series. It's nothing particularly amazing, and it just kind of works. In fact, I don't even really remember it all that well, which is kind of a shame, because I still remember the stuff from Ghost Recon 1, and that thing came out in 2001, so there you go. At least the sound effects are pretty decent. They've got some good effects going on with the weapons, although they're not particularly impressive. But at least they don't have the really corny suppressor sounds and such like that. They end up not really having much sound at all, actually, but at least it's not the corny pew 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 sound that you normally get with these goofy action games. So there is that, but ultimately the presentation just ends up not being particularly impressive. But ultimately what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this starts in the year 2024 with the Ghost Recon team, callsign Predator, being sent into Nicaragua to disrupt weapons trafficking, and they all end up being killed. So the second team, called Hunter, which is what you actually play for the rest of the game, is tasked to find out who set them up and ended up killing the team. Now here's the thing about Ghost Recon Future Soldier. For one, it's a Tom Clancy game, but for another, this came out in the same time that modern military shooters were being just beat to death, basically. So, just for fun, I'm going to give you 3 guesses as to what the actual enemy of the game is. No, really, guess. Did you say Russians? Because it's Russians. Of course it's Russians, right? It's a Tom Clancy game, but not only that, it's a game that was released in 2012. Of course the enemy is Russians. But oh, don't worry, they're ultra-nationalist Russians. And they're a rogue group, not real, proper Russians, or whatever the hell. Ugh. Regardless of what idiotic, contrived excuse they come up with, they took the lazy route. And the entire plot is just ridiculous. To the point where you quite literally cannot care about any remote thing in the game. Whether it be the idiotic plot, whether it be the rather annoyingly generic Call of Duty style cutscenes where it's got a map and it's shooting around the map and showing you different things on the map while a guy narrates, or the completely cardboard cutout squad that you've got where the only character I remember is Ghost Lead, simply because his name popped up the most in front of me when I was trying to do things. Quite literally, that is the only reason I remember Ghost Lead. I couldn't tell you what his name is. I couldn't tell you what any of the other characters' names are. The only character I can tell you who his name is Kozak. And that's only because I kept hearing his name over and over again as I would be sniped from halfway across the map through a massive friggin' dust cloud, so I, of course, couldn't see the enemy. And then they go, "Kozak's dead!" The wholehearted lack of effort on the plot just ends up making it absolutely pathetic, and frankly, the campaign ends up being incredibly irritating to play through as a result. But that's not just because of how crap the writing is in this thing. If it were just the writing, I'd be able to put that aside and go to the gameplay, and it's the gameplay where things really fall apart for this thing. You see, this is not Ghost Recon. This is not a tactical shooter. This is an arcade cover-based shooter with a mark and execute button. Quite literally, the only tactics in this game are to mark targets and then hold down that same button so your team executes those targets. That is it. You might mark a priority target during a gunfight, but that's it. You don't command your squad around, because you're not the squad leader. But what you can do is you can mark targets with the just standard looking around and pressing the mark button, or you can throw up a drone into the air and then pilot that around to mark targets, or you can, in very limited circumstances, take control of some other thing that's basically just plot related, like the Warhound drone, which is basically just a walking tank kind of thing that has a mortar on it, and you can take control of that and blow things away. It's basically easy mode for that entire mission. Or they'll have you take control of a guided missile as it falls in to hit the targets that you requested it in on, all sorts of things like that. Regardless of these particular moments, and the drone mechanic being available in pretty much every single level once you unlock it, the actual gameplay itself is really just a straight-up third-person cover-based shooter with some occasional stealth elements. You do get active camo that makes you pretty much invisible as long as you're crouched or prone, and so you can sneak around and get into cover and just take out enemies from a better position, or you can sneak up on enemies and do stealth kills. Yes, of course there are stealth kills in this thing. And that's kind of it, really. Other than this fairly rudimentary stealth, it's basically like if you took Gears of War and smashed it together with modern military shooters. And it's down to a T, where they have things like a breaching mechanic, because of course they have a breaching mechanic, and of course they use that at quite regular intervals, and it's rather tedious after the first time you do it. And of course they have a sequence where you're manning the machine gun on a chopper, in this case it's a minigun, and of course it has you shoot down an attack helicopter with it, because that's just something you do in modern shooters, of course. About the only things it does differently from other modern military shooters are the stealth elements, which on occasion it does force some no-detect stealth, as in if you get detected instantly the mission fails kind of things. But other than that, that's something that most modern military shooters don't really do very much of, or they only have it for one level. In this case, it's from pretty much the entire game. And the weapon customization. This is actually the one thing that's kind of cool about the game, where when you go in to customize your weapon, it's not just, oh, you stick an optic on it, you stick a vertical foregrip on it, so on and so forth. When you go into the menu to customize, it will actually pull the weapon apart into various components. And then you can look at these different components and swap them out for different components that affect the stats of the weapon differently. For example, you can stick in a different kind of trigger group, where it might be semi-auto, it might be burst fire, it might be full auto. You can stick in a different magazine loaded with different kinds of ammunition. You can stick in extended magazines. You can stick in a muzzle brake or a compensator or a suppressor on the barrel. You can change what length the barrel is. All sorts of things like that, and you can of course change the paint job. So that's all really cool, and you get to see the thing pull apart and go back together. And as you customize, you can actually go to the firing range and find out how these different things affect the actual feel of the weapon. And it's pretty seamless, which is all very, very cool. But unfortunately, that's a very tiny portion of the game. And you still have to unlock weapons and weapon parts by completing missions as well as completing challenges, at least for the single player. In the multiplayer, you basically just unlock things as you rank up, which is the standard modern military shooter way of doing things. So what you end up having there is a very cool feature that just doesn't really get a lot of time to shine. And that's kind of it. That's about the only things that really set this game apart, which is a real shame. And when you go over to the multiplayer side of things, there are two different kinds. You have Adversarial Multiplayer, and you have Co-op Multiplayer. The Co-op basically consists of the guerrilla mode, which is that you go into an area, you hold an area, and you fight off waves of enemies. And that's kind of it. On occasion, it will drop in a crate that has options of different weapons in it, or a crate to replenish your equipment and things like that. But generally speaking, it's just wave-based combat, and you're trying to hold a point as you do it. That's it. There's nothing really special about it other than the start of the map is that you go in stealth mode and try to control the point by taking out enemies before they all spot you. And that's kind of it, really. When you go over to the Adversarial Multiplayer, there are a bunch of objectives that will scatter around the maps that you can try to complete. But people like to spam grenades on these objectives, they will camp, and the ranking system kind of breaks the game because it locks all the good stuff behind the various rank ups. So you're going to run into people who are higher level than you and will just completely wipe the floor with you. On top of the serious connection problems that this thing has, and the ridiculous amount of lag that you'll experience, because if you're playing it on PC, guess what? There aren't that many people playing it anymore. And you have to set it to any mode in order to actually be able to find any games now. So, fair warning there. It may be better on console where there probably was a higher player base, but on PC, it's just barren, really. I didn't even manage to get into any full games, so there you go. But even then, I was just getting my ass completely handed to me because I hadn't unlocked anything. My gun recoiled like crazy, which at least the weapons handle more like the older school Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six games, as in there's a fair amount of recoil and you have to actually aim and things like that. But it's very arcadey with the way the damage works, and you got regenerating health. So that's fun, isn't it? but what you're ultimately left with is just a mess of a game. On PC, you'll run into problems like not only performance issues like I've mentioned before, but also glitches where you're going to have to reload a save because, of course, it glitched out with something and didn't spawn something in or something like that. Or you're going to run into things like your keybinds not actually rebinding, even though you very clearly rebound them and saved and everything. And then you go into game and they might work for a bit, and then you maybe quit the game and go back to it, and suddenly your keybinds are changed again. And any number of other glitches, as well as connection problems in the multiplayer, with the lag being a pretty significant issue. But even apart from that, the level design is just incredibly linear, and it's very obvious cover-based level design, so you're going to have a lot of chest-high walls that you're going to run up to and take cover behind. You're going to find that some cover degrades, but not all of it, which sounds like it might be cool, except that once you figure out what cover doesn't degrade, then you're just going to always take cover behind that and ignore the other cover entirely. You've got some very obvious modern military tropes in the gameplay mechanics, where it's just waves and waves and waves of enemies, a lot of which will spam grenades at you, and even more idiotic things like having you fight vehicles with bullets, and that doesn't even make sense, but it also is incredibly easy, even on the hardest difficulty setting. In fact, that's the only setting where I found even a remote challenge, and at that point it was only even challenging because bullets killed you in basically 2 hits, because they just raise the damage and not the AI. See, the AI in this game isn't very good either. They'll all take cover, they might charge you with shotguns, and that's kind of it, really. So they're really easy to take down. Also, you can shoot through some of the cover, so that makes things even easier. Multiplayer is just flat out unbalanced and unfair to newer players, and if you haven't unlocked everything, then you're just at a blatant disadvantage. The gameplay itself is not tactical. It has basically nothing to do with Ghost Recon, and more importantly, it's not fun. This thing has basically nothing going well for it. It's not the worst game I've ever played or anything like that, but there is no reason to play Ghost Recon Future Soldier. If you're a fan of the older Ghost Recon games, you're going to look at this and go, well, what the hell is this? This isn't Ghost Recon. If you're a fan of modern military shooters, there's plenty of better options out there, and you're going to find that pretty easily. If you're a fan of cover-based shooters, there's better options out there. You're going to look for those. And ultimately, it's just going to fall by the wayside, as it always would have. They should have seen going into this that their simplistic as hell mark and execute system was not going to cut it for tactical shooter gameplay. You really need a lot more squad mechanics. You need a lot more tactics. You don't throw mark and execute and customizable loadouts into a modern military cover-based shooter and say, oh, it's a tactical shooter now. Doesn't work that way. The game just ends up being a buggy, tedious, extremely poor performing mess of a game, and I cannot recommend it in the slightest. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.